Bernard de Montreal. Preparatory Communication number 106. Dealing with negative memories and suffering. To understand the phenomenon of negative memory, we need to understand the phenomenon of suffering and the thoughts linked to negative memory, the memory that causes suffering. The most harmful thing about negative memory, the memory that causes suffering, is that it prevents us from living in the present. In other words, it prevents us from living in our spirit. So it uses his state of emotional and astral consciousness to confuse his intelligence by using a multitude of forms of rationalism to keep him in the past, instead of allowing him to live in a state of mind that coincides with his present creativity, his creativity of spirit. Negative memory is an aspect of man's consciousness that encourages the exploitation of his emotions, that encourages the exploitation of the subjectivity of the ego to hinder the development and descent of the spirit, so that man, instead of living from his spirit, lives from the energy of the soul. That is to say, from the energy of memory. That is to say, from the astral energy within him. Negative memory immediately prevents man from noticing, observing and realizing that every experience, even if painful, is good. In other words, that it helps us to evolve. That it helps him to understand things that we wouldn't have been able to understand without this experience. In other words, it helps him to evolve and eventually to improve his personal life. Negative memory powerfully prevents man from achieving this. So it deprives him of the real benefit of suffering, leaving him only with the wounds of suffering. So this suffering, this negative memory, hinders the link between man and his spirit, hinders the natural and gradual development of this relationship, and automatically prevents man from feeling good about himself. Why does suffering, the negative memory of suffering, keep coming back to test us, to plunge us back into our past? This is because the ego is not yet sufficiently conscious, powerful, of his spirit to support the emptiness of the spirit. Not being able to withstand the emptiness of the spirit, he must be filled with another energy, which is the energy of its astral consciousness, the energy of this negative memory. If the ego understands the mechanism of this negative energy, he can learn to correct its excesses, to correct its comings and goings, to eventually neutralize this energy. But the point is that the ego, not being able to live in total emptiness, must live in a condition where the negative memory fills him until the day when he can live permanently in the total and permanent emptiness of his mind. Man is the natural scapegoat of negative memory. And he remains the sufferer of this negative memory until he has sufficiently replaced the astral energy of this memory with the creative energy of his spirit. And as long as he has not realized that the experience which brought him suffering was in fact an experience created precisely to bring him to overcome the effect, the affliction, of the negative memory, to bring it eventually into direct, perfect connection with his spirit. With the aim of destroying in him all subjective reflection which is part of the past, and creating in him instantaneous creation, that is to say instantaneous intelligence of his state, of his life, and of his reason for being. As long as the ego is not capable of seeing, of immediately overcoming the value of the suffering memory, he is not capable of being in his spirit. Because you have to be in your spirit to be able, coldly, mentally or supramentally, to overcome the psychological value created, on the level of your emotions and your lower mind, by the suffering endlessly reported by the negative memory. So the aim of the ego, through the experience that creates this suffering, is to be able to neutralize the power of the negative memory as it arises. And he can do this if he has sufficient understanding of the laws of his spirit, and applies these laws according to the time and rhythm that his negative memory uses to make him suffer. As long as man does not have sufficient consciousness, negative memory serves the evolution of his soul. It serves the evolution of the lower aspects of himself. When man has sufficient consciousness, when he knows the laws of the ego, the laws of the spirit, the laws of the soul, the laws of suffering, the laws of memory, this negative memory is used by him for the development of a higher consciousness through the transmutation of emotionality and subjective thought, in order to create a link, a narrow bridge, between the ego and his spirit. But, for man to create a link between the ego and his spirit by using the energy of the negative memory, he must not allow himself to be lured by the psychological value of the negative memory. He must be able to superimpose onto this negative memory a higher energy, in other words a higher consciousness. It is then that the negative memory, instead of hindering man's development by making use of his emotionality and his inferior mind, is used for the transmutation of his principles, for the reorganization of a superior mental psychic structure which becomes the seat of his spirit and his intelligence. But if he allows himself to be deceived, if he follows in its footsteps, if he plays the game of memory, if he indulges in memory, he automatically loses the game. Without realizing it, the ego maintains the negative memory. This raises emotions within the ego that act on the mind, and the mind acts on the emotions, and this becomes a vicious circle. The ego must learn not to play the game of the memory. But to do this, it must be sufficiently conscious, sufficiently evolved, and sufficiently mental to understand the laws of the spirit, and not play the game of the self-indulgent ego, which is masochistic in a sense. The ego, if he is minimally in his mind at all, must be able not to give negative memory no reason for reflection. It must be able to prevent the past from entering its present. And to be able to do this, he must be sufficiently intelligent, that is, sufficiently aware of the illusion of negative memory. Whatever reasons he may dangle before its eyes, because negative memory, the memory of suffering, can always give the ego reasons that are often reasonable, but it is not the fact that the reasons of negative memory linked to suffering are reasonable that is the case. That is precisely the trap. It's that the ego has to go beyond the reason that the negative memory gives him. Even it brings a plate to charm him. He must go beyond reason and neutralize it, uproot it instantly, so that he can live only in the emptiness of his spirit. That is to say, so that he can live only in the moment, and not make use of the past for any reason whatsoever, in order to create a placebo for himself, in order to pamper himself, in order to feed himself astrally. He must not give the negative memory any chance at all to penetrate him and affect him emotionally and mentally. So if it comes, he lets it come. But he doesn't deal with it. He lets it come like a neighbor who is not pleasant, a neighbor who is not necessary in his life, but who has to live next door to him for a while until he moves out. It is not the negative experience, the experience of suffering in man's life, that is essentially the problem. It is his attitude towards this experience of suffering. If man was really conscious, every experience in his life would be good. Because every experience in his life would lead him to be more and more in his spirit, and less in the memory of his ego, in the past of his life, and therefore in the suffering of his life. Man could therefore have a multitude of experiences, more or less interesting, but in no way linked to suffering. There would be no suffering in him. There would be a loss of energy. There would be a slowing down of his energy. But there would be no psychological suffering. There would simply be an overcoming, and an overcoming. until man could live through all kinds of experiences at all possible levels, without being affected by them, because he would only live these experiences in the present of his spirit, instead of living them in the past of his ego, and therefore instead of suffering psychologically on the level of emotion and on the level of subjective thought. So as man is not able to deal directly with his spirit, he is not able to absorb the negative energy of experience. And this prevents him from being able to live through the experience without being affected by it, without being brought into a state of depression by it. In other words, he is not able to benefit immediately from the experience. He has to benefit from it over a long period of time, over months, over years. And during this time he loses energy. During this time he only deals with his astral consciousness, instead of dealing directly with his inner being, his spirit, his real intelligence. So he loses contact with the transformational force of his spirit, to be left only with the psychological powerlessness of his ego. It is not a question of man at this stage being without negative memory, since he is not in a sufficiently advanced state of fusion. But it is important for man at this stage not to feed his negative memory by not giving it any support, by not giving it any psychological value whatsoever. The ego must be sufficiently perceptive, sufficiently intelligent, sufficiently lucid, to be able to realize that the negative memory that arises from suffering has nothing in itself that is good or right for him, at any level whatsoever. It is the suffering that is understood and realized that becomes good for him, and not the negative memory of that suffering. It is the vibratory change in his bodies created by the suffering that becomes good for him. It is the pure experience that becomes good for him, not the memory of the experience. We must remember this. And I repeat, it is pure, cold, vibratory experience that becomes good for the ego, not the memory of experience. When the ego lives an experience that creates suffering, in the very moment, in the present of this suffering experience, there is transformation, there is evolution if the ego knows the laws of life. But if the ego allows itself to be subjugated by the astral laws of negative memory, he loses the benefit of this experience. He loses the benefit of the energy. And it will be necessary for him to live with this suffering for weeks, months, even years, instead of cutting with it instantly and going to the depths of himself to find what it needs to become greater and greater, more and more solid, more and more autonomous, more and more centrical, more and more mental. But of course this is not easy. Because giving value to negative memory is part of the ego's mechanism of insecurity. The ego, being insecure until he is no longer insecure, is obliged to give his experience, the memory of his experience, some kind of value. And this is why, deep down, the negative memory of suffering due to the past is naturally and essentially part of the ego's insecurity. And where does the ego's insecurity come from? It comes from a lack of connection with the spirit. And the other will say, but yes. But the spirit, my spirit, where is it? It doesn't sit at the table with me every Sunday. Where is this spirit? This impalpable part of myself. Let me tell you. Your spirit is your real intelligence. It's not a question of being able to delimit your spirit. It's a question of you knowing, realizing, living a real intelligence. And man knows his real intelligence when he lives it. Because when he lives his real intelligence, he does not live life as he lives it when he is in his factitious intelligence, when he is in the intelligence of his ego, when he is in the intelligence of his subjectivity, when he is in the intelligence of his subjective thoughts. So when man is in his intelligence, his human, emotional and mental behavior is different. And there are, in the life of man, experiences where he knows, where he feels his real intelligence, that is to say his spirit. And it is from this spirit that he must live. It is from this intelligence that he must recognize the subtlety of the alienation created in him, for all sorts of reasons, by the negative memory of suffering experienced in the past. When man is in his true intelligence, he cannot rationalize suffering. He lives it. That's all. But as soon as he rationalizes it for one reason or another, he's not in his real intelligence. He's not in his spirit. He's in his ego. He's in his intellect. He's in his lower mind. And this lower mind is automatically affected by his emotion. So his subjective aspect is colored, affected, infected by negative memory. So man is subject to experience, instead of benefiting from experience. He is governed by the laws of the soul, instead of being governed by the laws of the spirit. Man often says, time fixes everything. It's true that time fixes things. But time fixes things because man is not in his spirit. If man were in his spirit, he wouldn't have to wait for time to sort things out for things to be sorted out. Things would be fixed in the present, instantly, because he would be in his spirit. So if time fixes things, it's a saying that's true. Because man lives from the experience of negative memory. And negative memory disappears over time. Disappears. Because man changes. Man perceives. Man transforms. Man becomes aware. Life changes. But what a waste of time. What an enormous waste of time. If a man has to wait 10 years for time to change things in his life, he is wasting 10 years of his life. But if man is sufficiently in his spirit not to wait 10 years for time to put things right, imagine the time he saves, and imagine how much quicker he can live on the material plane, and how much quicker he can feel good about himself, how much quicker he can be happy, and so on. So the ego must realize that the suffering of the experience constantly brought back by the negative memory is not a real value. The real value of the experience is in the vibratory attention experienced at the moment of the experience. And anything else brought back to him is worthless. And if the ego is able to understand this, he is already entering his mind and growing. So the time comes when the ego is no longer living experience. He is living on the energy of experience. And it is from this moment onwards that the ego moves very quickly through life. That he rapidly climbs the steps of life, and that one day he is able to surpass all the planetary conditions of his existence. He then lives on energy and movement without reflection. It is then that we can say that man is free, that man is conscious, that man is master of his life, that he is in life, and that he can live life to the extent and height that he wants because he is free of the planetary influence on his emotions and his mind. It is the negative memory that prevents man from being happy on a material level. It is this memory that prevents him from forming a close bond with himself. And this is why he must gradually learn how to control it, how to avoid its excesses. And to do this, he must not delude himself. He must not tell himself stories. He must not rationalize and constantly try to find something in the negative memory to relieve himself, or to give himself some kind of reason. Where man has to be careful is in the area of emotion. In the past, the emotion of experience positively colored life. But then the emotion of experience, because of suffering, discolored life and took away energy. Emotion can go either way. It gives energy or it takes it away. And when man is a prisoner of negative memory, the emotion it arouses takes energy away. And man must be aware of this. Man cannot lose energy. And for man to be aware of this, he must take control of the mechanisms of memory and restrict them. He must realize that negative memory is the past, that it has no real value, that it is only a subjective negative value that creates suffering and prevents man from continuing. That is to say, from going further in the evolution of his being, from going further in the progress of his life, and from eventually conquering life for his own benefit, for his own well-being, and so on. Man must learn to live on the energy of his spirit and not simply on the astral energy of his ego. It is obvious that the positive astral energy that we call positive experience creates vitality in man's life. But by the same token, the negative astral energy reflected by negative memory creates a loss of vitality in man. During involution, man lived on the plane of experience according to the positive energy of experience and memory, which made him happy. He lived on the negative energy of experience and memory, which made him unhappy. But during evolution in the new cycle, man must live on the energy of the spirit. And when he is able to live on the energy of the spirit, all experience is creative for him. He no longer suffers from the experience, because it is no longer colored negatively or positively. It is simply a part of life. It is part of the activity of the spirit through man, and it is understood as being the movement of life in man. It is no longer astral. It is simply mental. This does not mean that it is not as interesting as before, but that it is no longer colored by negative emotionality. This is why we say that it is mental. That is to say that it is realized on another vibratory plane. It is understood in terms of a higher energy, instead of being experienced in terms of a lower, subjective energy that can create suffering in certain cases and bring to man the negative memory of this suffering. It is through negative thoughts that negative memory is brought to man. It is through these negative thoughts that man's emotional energy is raised to disturb his lower mind and prevent him from living his experience outside, completely outside, the negative memory of this experience. Negative thoughts are conveyed to man by forces within him that seek to use his emotions as much as possible by using his thoughts and his energy so that these forces can live off him. Live off his experience. In other words, live in a parasitic way. Man must understand the phenomenon of negative thinking. He must realize that currents within him are constantly moving in order to use his lower energy so that these forces, these currents, are fed. But it is not man's function to feed the astral forces within him. On the contrary, man must rid himself of these forces, These currents of energy created by subjective thought, by negative memory, in order to free himself and rest in his spirit. Man is a creature of habits. He's used to living with negative memories. He's used to being fed negative thoughts. He's used to living in the past. And this habit is deeply rooted in him. And that's why negative memory is so powerful. It has a power over him. And this power is part of the power of the astral consciousness over and against the mental consciousness of man. It is the power of the astral in man against the power of his own light. The energy of negative memory is a vast network of energy that enters man. Because man, for all sorts of reasons, rational and irrational, allows this energy to penetrate him. He rationalizes this energy. He opens the door to it. He gives it the key. And he always loses out because this energy cannot solve the problems of experience. All this energy does is create suffering in him and keep him a prisoner of the past, so that he is not in the present of his intelligence. This is the game of the astral within man. And it is a game that can go very far. Because it is a game that is not under man's control, but under the control of forces within him that are part of his unconscious. Negative memories are part of the forces within man that come and go. Forces that can be called karmic forces, which must be purified over time by his spirit. It's a bit like the phenomenon of laundering. The laundry has to be cleaned and cleaned and cleaned until it is completely bleached. So the negative memory is like dirty laundry that has to be laundered, and it is recycled in man's cleaning system. In other words, in man's psyche, until his spirit is sufficiently powerful to totally bleach this material, to eliminate it completely, so that man has a pure consciousness, an increasingly perfected consciousness. From that moment on, the karmic, astral forces in man no longer have any power over him, and he is no longer governed by planetary laws. Man is very sensitive to negative memory, because he is too much in his personality. He is not sufficiently in his person. And his personality is the measure of the relationship between his thoughts, his memory and his ego. Man must be in his person so that his personality is only the expression of his person, so that the personality is the support of his person in life, instead of being the fulcrum in his life of the activity of his negative memory through the mental and emotional. Man must therefore correct the relationship between his personality and his person, if he wants to correct the relationship between his negative subjective memory and his ego. When man will be as in his person, he will naturally be in his spirit, and he will no longer suffer in his personality. So he will no longer suffer from the effect that the negative memory of his suffering has on his ego. He will be free. He will be free of the polarity of experience. He will live only on the energy of experience in the present moment, instead of living according to a past that hinders the evolution of his personality and prevents man from knowing, feeling, living at the level of his person, that is to say his spirit, his intelligence. So there is a very close link between personality and negative memory, and man must realize this. He must see, he must understand, that where there is a lot of negative memory, there is a lot of personality. Where there is less negative memory, there is less personality. The more there is of the person. In other words, the more centricity, identity, reality and spirit there is. Man's spirit, his real intelligence, is more mature and wiser than his whole personality. Man's spirit is his very essence. His personality is only a fiction, only a psychological organization. As long as man is not in his person, he cannot feel creative in his spirit, because his personality takes all the material of his emotion and thought to cut itself off from his spirit. So if man suffers, if he has an experience that makes him suffer, that generates negative memories, it's obvious that he loses the ability to vitalize himself. He loses the ability to make himself new imminently in the present. So he loses the ability to be alive, to be well, to be real. The spirit of man needs the person of man, not the personality of man. So the personality must be adjusted so that it becomes the real person of man. And this requires that emotionality and subjective thought to be adjusted to a higher level of consciousness so that man is in his spirit, living as a person and projecting into the world the personality he needs to work, to live. But if the spirit does not have a person on which to base its activity, it will be obliged to trick the personality, so that the latter, through experience, suffering and negative memory, comes to tear the veil of its subjectivity, so that it really becomes the imprimatur of its reality, and therefore a person. It is from this moment that we can speak of the maturity of man, the true, great maturity of man, where there is no longer any distinction between the spirit, the person, and the personality. If man could categorically overthrow the power of negative memory in his spirit, he would automatically and immediately transform his emotionality, his superior mentality, into superior energy, So he would become real. He would become a real person. He would no longer be subject to his personality. But for this to happen, he must do it categorically. He must realize it categorically. He must know it as the only way to transform his lower principles. He must know it as the only answer to man's problems, to man's psychological problems, to man's personality problems. Man cannot suffer constantly from his personality. There comes a day when he must overcome the elements of his personality which afflict him, and which constantly bring towards him by mechanism the insecurity of the ego, the thought material of negative memory. Man must one day come to have a personality that is the projection of his person, instead of living with a personality that is fundamentally weighed down by insecurities of all kinds that are increasingly fed by the negative memory of suffering experience. Man does not have much choice in life. He has either the choice of being unconscious and suffering subjectively, or of becoming conscious and projecting, or rather piercing his person through his personality. If he is capable of doing this, if he is capable of projecting his person through all the games, all the colors of his personality, it is obvious that man can live very well on earth, that he can have a multitude of experiences on earth, because he will never suffer. When I say that he will never suffer, I mean that he will not suffer on the level of his personality. He'll probably experience the tensions, but he won't suffer psychologically in his mind or in his emotions. So he will transform this experience, the energy of this experience, and will himself be greater and more solid. The ego is a bit naive, a bit masochistic, a bit like a child. He looks at suffering. He likes to look at suffering, believing that he will be able to decipher something in the suffering, that he will be able to understand something in the memory of suffering. And it's an illusion, because the suffering or its memory is already inscribed. It's already done. It's already established. The ego no longer has to search, to study, to try to understand. He simply has to be capable of not being affected by the negative memory. He must be able to superimpose creative thoughts on negative thoughts in order to neutralize the vibration of his thoughts. There are beings who suffer, who have suffered, and who have the inner strength, the inner power, to overcome the psychological immaturity of the ego, and to impose on their mind, to impose on their personality, a condition of life which is born of their spirit and which makes them imperturbable.